Good afternoon. On behalf of the Research and Policy and Development program here at ODI and ALNAP, I'd like to welcome you to our event, Beyond Methods, Unpacking Evaluation Challenges. As I think many of you know, 2015 is the International Year of Evaluation. And I must admit that several months ago when we talked about convening an event, I don't think we quite anticipated the response that we would get. More than 500 people wanting to register, reaching capacity nearly 1 month before the event was scheduled to take place. So in addition to the full room we have here in London, we have several hundred people joining us online, together representing NGOs, donor agencies, UN institutions, universities, government, media, and the private sector. So welcome to you all, and please do join our conversation throughout the event on Twitter at #eval2015. At a fundamental level, I think people involved in development and humanitarian efforts aim to improve the human condition. And I would argue that people gathered here today believe that credible evidence is one important way to do this. Yet our ability to systematically conduct and learn from evaluation is often challenged by the way in which development takes place. Multi-component, multi-level interventions aiming to affect change with individuals, with communities, with institutions, with policy, operating in environments of uncertainty, and often delivered through multiple sites, through complicated organizational configurations, like consortia arrangements and networks, involving a multitude of different stakeholders with diverse perspectives. In the field of evaluation, there have been many lively debates around methods for data collection and analysis, which are certainly important. But these debates have often overshadowed discussion of political and operational challenges. I think collectively we have neglected other stages of the evaluation process, particularly around framing and prioritizing evaluation efforts and institutionalizing inquiry so that monitoring and evaluation contributes to learning. And I think the overwhelming response we've received to this event today really reflects how many people and organizations struggle with some of these common challenges. In a review earlier this year, Michael Quinn Patton critiqued evaluators for pretending to evaluate comprehensive policy interventions without telling policymakers that what they're asking for can't be done, but will take a shot at it anyway and blame the inadequate results on complexity. What we're aiming to do here today is really to delve into some of these political and operational challenges of institutionalizing evidence-based learning and talk about strategies for how to overcome Patton's critique. We are fortunate to have 4 thoughtful speakers with us today who approach these challenges from distinct perspectives, from a think tank, from a donor agency, an implementing NGO, and an independent evaluation expert. Each of our 3 presenters will speak for 10 minutes, and then we'll hear from our discussant, and then we'll open the floor to questions and discussions. And so for those of you joining online, please do send your questions in, because we'll be taking questions from the online group as well. Joining us today are Simon Hearn, who's a research fellow here at ODI, and our resident outcome mapping guru, and the global coordinator for the outcome mapping learning community, and a founding member of Better Evaluation. Simon specializes in the role that evaluation and organizational learning can play in improving programs and systems. Laura Smethurst is the DFID evaluation advisor for the UK government's conflict and stability programming in Syria. Prior to joining DFID, she spent several years working on mixed methods research with a focus on maternal and child health and mass media communications in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa. Mikkel Nedergaard is an M&E advisor for the Danish Refugee Council with 10 years of experience in humanitarian NGOs. His current work focuses on strengthening the use of monitoring and evaluation for learning. And finally, we're fortunate to have with us Rick Davies, who will serve as our discussant. Rick is an independent evaluation consultant who works with development aid organizations on capacity building, the management of evaluations, design of M&E strategies and frameworks, and the development of evaluation methodologies. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Simon to kick us off. And Simon will help frame our discussion today, and we'll talk specifically around framing impact.
Thanks, Anne. So I've been asked to provide a framing for today's discussion, and I'm going to do that by showing some highlights from our work on evaluation. And our work includes undertaking some evaluations, but also learning about evaluation through some research on evaluation. So I'm going to start by presenting a particular framework that has helped us to understand evaluation challenges and evaluation practice. And then I'll finish by talking about one particular issue that I think we all need to engage with more actively, and that is this concept of impact. So the Methods Lab marks our most recent foray into systematic learning about evaluation. It's set out in 2012 to test and to develop, test and institutionalize innovative approaches to evaluation. But we didn't start with a very clear idea of what we meant by this. What's innovative, what's a method, and what's impact evaluation anyway? Often when we think about methods, we automatically think about methods for data collection and data analysis and causal inference. And this was certainly in our minds when we started this process. And one of the first publications from the Methods Lab was about realist evaluation. But we quickly realized that many of the challenges in evaluation are not necessarily methodological in this sense, but they relate to a broader idea of evaluation methodology. And our partnership with Better Evaluation sort of helped to broaden our view on what these challenges are. So the Better Evaluation framework, there's some handouts outside if you want to learn more about this, but it's essentially 7 clusters of common tasks involved in evaluation. And the Better Evaluation website presents methods for evaluation under each of these 7 tasks. So the first one is about managing evaluations, including who is going to be involved in defining this evaluation, who is involved in making decisions about the evaluation, and how does all that get done. The second one is about developing or obtaining a description about the thing that's going to be evaluated, defining this evaluand, and how it is understood to work as well. So things like theories of change, logical models, that all comes in there. Framing is about setting the parameters for the evaluation. What's its purpose? What are the key evaluation questions? What are the criteria and standards that are going to be used to make judgments in this evaluation? And then you come to describing, which is about collecting data to answer descriptive questions about what the program has done, about its results, and about the context in which it's been operating. Understanding causes is then about analysing and collecting more data to answer causal questions. What's caused these observed changes? Synthesis is then combining the data to form an overall judgment about the merit or worth of that program, but also about learning across evaluations. And then reporting and supporting use is about developing and presenting findings in a way where the evaluation can actually be used by its intended users. So we set out then to look at the challenges and look at what innovative methods can be developed across these 7 clusters. And we did this through some ongoing evaluations, but also through working on 5 particular case studies of Australian aid-funded programs. And we had hoped to undertake in this project some full impact evaluation studies, but unfortunately it corresponded with cuts in the Australian budget, and our ambitions were not met in that way. And in short, what we have learned is that most of the challenges we were working with, most of the innovation that's needed was actually around those first 3. The first 3 elements in this framework. So things like learning about the relationship between the evaluator, the commissioner, and other stakeholders, learning how to be clearer about what is being evaluated, and what the questions are. Learning how to decide if something is valuable, looking at the plausibility, the utility and the feasibility of an evaluation. And learning how to approach evaluation of multi-component programs. And then learning how to prioritize the endless wish lists that are built into many M&E systems. And these are the things that we were up against. So rather than impact evaluations as we often see them, which is either as research that runs in parallel to a program or a study that's done at the end of a program, we found that there was much more appetite in building what we've come to call an impact-oriented M&E systems. That the managers of programs and implementers of programs were more interested in how they can develop their own understanding of their impact. And so this brings me then to my sort of more specific point that I wanted to make today, and one of the messages from our work, which is that we need to do more to communicate what we mean by impact. So what is impact anyway? It's become a bit of an obsession in the development industry, and I think that's due in part because of decreasing budgets or retargeting budgets. But there's also greater public sensitivity to overseas spending, and donors are focusing much more on demonstrating value for money and wanting stories of impact. But impact can be quite a confusing concept, and it's not surprising when we look at some of the definitions that we use. This is one of the most common ones that I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar with from the OECD DAC. So impact is positive and negative, primary and secondary long-term effects produced by a development intervention directly or indirectly, intended or unintended. This is quite broad, to say the least. Another common definition comes from the domains of economics and statistics and is used in many impact evaluations. So impact, and this comes from a 3IE paper, impact is defined as the difference in the indicator of interest y with the intervention y1 and without the intervention y0. That is, impact equals y1 minus y0, which looks completely different to that first definition. So what do? We find that when we look at agency-specific definitions, then it varies as well. A lot of agencies use the results chain to define impact, sort of distinguishing it from these other kinds of results called outputs or outcomes. Then there's differences in where we focus our impact. A lot of agencies say that impact is about end beneficiaries and people and communities in the countries where programs are operating. Then there's the elephant in the room. In a lot of domains, impact means environmental impact. And you'd expect that to play a bigger part in what we mean by impact, given the strong focus on climate change. The way we frame impact has a big effect on our programs, on the whole cycle of program management. I think it affects the level of risk and ambition in the design stages. It affects how programs are going to be judged, what yardstick is going to be used. And it affects what we can learn from programs to help it adapt or to contribute to other programs. So how do we reconcile these different definitions and these different ideas of impact? One way I can suggest is to be a bit more concrete about the language we're using when we talk about impact. And I just want to highlight six things we can consider when we talk about impact. So how do we use this term? Are we describing intended or desirable change? Are we talking about forecasting the expected impact? Or is it a measurement of impact that has occurred? The focus, are we wanting to narrow down on some preset indicators, or do we want to keep it very broad and think about as much variability and impact as makes sense? The level of change, are we talking about impact on individuals, on communities, on households, on organizations or institutions, on sectors or states, or the environment? Then there's degrees of separation. So in our understanding of impact, does impact occur very close to the intervention, or does it happen several stages down? The change trajectory as well, is our idea of impact static? This project achieved this much impact, or is it dynamic, that sometimes it's high, sometimes it's low, depending on when you come in and measure it? And does it always have to take a long time to produce impact, or can you actually see impact quite early on in some cases? And then there's the homogeneity of benefits. Does everyone receive impact in the same way, or is there variance in how different beneficiaries perceive their own impact? So I think the hope in sort of looking at these things is that we can try to find a middle ground between this very specific econometric definition of impact and the very broad, all-encompassing OECD definition, and to find something that's more contextually appropriate and useful. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon. We'll hear next from Laura, who will share some of DFID's processes in terms of deciding how they prioritize what to evaluate, and give some specific examples about their M&E approach in Syria.
Thank you, Anne. Hi, everyone. I think most of you have worked with DFID in some capacity, so you probably know enough about us to know we work in a good few countries and across various thematic areas to actually have the potential to evaluate a lot of different projects and programs, and we also have varying evidence needs. But we do recognise that we can't evaluate everything, and we don't want to, so how do we prioritise? I think it's important to go back to why do we evaluate within DFID, and the two key reasons are really to address the shorter term evidence needs, but also the longer term evidence needs. So we evaluate partially to create reliable knowledge to really use to inform and improve our programmes. But we also evaluate to try to answer the bigger development questions, to contribute to the evidence base and really understand how as an organisation we should be moving forward. And maybe this point's a bit of an obvious one, but how we decide what to evaluate is of course very closely linked to how we structure ourselves. And before 2011, we had a very centralised model of evaluation. So all of our evaluations were actually identified and commissioned by a central evaluation department. And this led to a lot of thematic evaluations being commissioned, which arguably contributed to the evidence base. But what we found was the findings weren't really being used at the local level to inform the design and implementation of programmes. So alongside the higher demand to really expand evaluation within DFID from 2011, we decided to decentralise the model and really hand over the power and responsibility to identify and commission evaluations to spending units or country offices. So what happened? Well, this strategy was partially successful in terms of we did see a big increase in the use of evaluation, and we also saw an increase in the use of evaluation findings at the local level, so to inform programmes. But then we also saw quite an uneven distribution of evaluation, both geographically but also thematically. So we saw a big increase in evaluation in areas such as health and education, but less so in wealth creation and governance, which are of course also priority issues for the Secretary of State and the organisation. Also, we were finding our evaluations weren't always filling these key knowledge gaps and really contributing to the long-term evidence base. So in 2014, we developed the DFID evaluation strategy to partially address some of these issues. And a key feature of the strategy is really trying to prioritise more and better, both at the corporate and country level. And this prioritisation process is really happening at the moment and over the next few months. And I think there's two key components of it. Firstly, the evaluation department's trying to develop more support and guidance for country teams to help them actually identify which evaluations are important. And this includes evaluation tools with proposed criteria such as size of projects, valuability, is it a pilot, to help them really determine, at least make the first cut around what should they be prioritising in terms of evaluation. We're also encouraging country teams to develop evidence plans. So get them to really engage all the relevant stakeholders, including governments, and identify what's important for them to evaluate and prioritise in terms of evidence at the country level, but also bring in the corporate priorities. And the second component is for the evaluation department to prioritise across the board which evaluations should they be focusing their support to really ensure good quality. And just a note as well, of course, we need to work with our supplier base to ensure that we have the right suppliers who can help us deliver these evaluations. And as many of you might know, we're actually currently redeveloping our global evaluation framework, the GFA. So just a bit of a plug here that we do have an early market engagement meeting on the 23rd of October, and we're especially interested from hearing from new suppliers and 7 suppliers. So how does this all pan out at the country level? So a focus of today's event was around working in complex and challenging environments, and I think Syria certainly fits the bill in those terms. I'm going to be talking a bit about the Syria Conflict and Stability Programming, which is the programming that I work on. So it's the non-humanitarian programming, and it's a cross-departmental portfolio, meaning that some programs are managed by DFID and some by the Foreign Office, and to a lesser degree the Ministry of Defence. As you can see, the type of programmes are quite varied. Within DFID, we run the governance strand, which includes local governance programmes as well as livelihoods and education. But the photo on the slide is actually from a civil defence stroke search and rescue project, which is run by the Foreign Office. Because we work in moderate opposition-controlled areas of Syria, international access is very limited. So most of our programmes are actually managed by international partners who are based outside of Syria, but work with a handful of Syrians on the ground. It's also an active, protracted conflict, so it's quite a changing and high-risk context, of course. And that means, for example, the front lines are changing all the time, so our areas of operation are changing all the time. And the areas where we do operate it are becoming increasingly fragmented. So there's a real need for flexible and adaptive programming. This, of course, also brings up many monitoring and evaluation challenges. We're quite limited with the types of methods we can use. We're quite limited with the type of data we can collect and where we can collect it. There's limited opportunities for quality assurance of evaluation. Most of the people on the ground who are collecting the data are trained and monitored remotely. And in some areas of Syria, people are so suspicious of research, even interviewers can't take notes whilst doing interviews or conducting focus groups. We also have to ensure that our monitoring and evaluation is conflict sensitive, because in this kind of context, if we don't do it right, it can actually do a lot of harm. So how do we prioritise our monitoring and evaluation resources? So you might notice I've stuck the monitoring in next to the evaluation, and that's, I think, really reflecting the context and the lack of oversight. There's a real need for independent monitoring, and it does vary by project what the needs are, but we do actually need to have this from the results chain perspective, from the input through to the outcome level. And there is a question around, should we be trying to evaluate the outcomes of programs when we can't actually be confident of what the inputs or activities are? We tend to prioritise higher value and higher risk projects, but they're not necessarily always the same projects. Evaluability of projects, of course. How feasible is it to really evaluate projects? Some of our projects include a kind of counter-ISIL narrative. So to what extent is it actually feasible to go and start asking questions around ISIL in these areas? And of course, we have to consider the evidence base and what we can contribute to the evidence base and organisational learning. Whilst there is emergent evidence base on governance and education, there's very little evidence of actually what works in active conflict zones. And then there's more current evidence priorities across government, migration being a very current one. So we need to start thinking about how does that relate to our theories of change, and should we be looking at evaluating it, and how could we do that? So how do we approach the monitoring and evaluation in such a challenging context? Well, first of all, of course, we need to be really flexible and pragmatic. We have to be very realistic about what we can do and what we can't do, and really set expectations of our suppliers as well. We're currently piloting a small-scale formative evaluation of our local governance programme. So we're really going to see how that goes and then go from there. We're mostly using qualitative methods. I personally don't think you can do robust quantitative work in such a context, so why should we be doing it? You have to use other data where available, and this includes using implementers monitoring data and social media data for triangulation, and really focusing on the context. So thinking, what impact does the context have on our interventions and vice versa? This may include doing conflict analysis or political economy analysis where we can. And key stakeholders, really thinking about how we can be meeting shorter term information needs and plugging them into reviews of theories of change. How can our M&E systems be set up to enable that? But the question remains, what is the most effective way of meeting our evidence needs? I think the direction we're quite interested in traveling in is really looking at how we can kind of boost our independent monitoring so it's more comprehensive and it's looking across the results chain. But whilst this might meet our shorter term evidence needs, how can we actually build in more of an evaluative function which will enable us to say something in the long term and really contribute to wider learning? And I'm really happy to hear anyone's views on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. We'll next hear from Mikkel, who will talk about the Danish Refugee Council's efforts to institutionalize the use of evaluation to foster learning. And the Danish Refugee Council is a member of ALNAP, and so he's going to speak a bit about the ALNAP network as well.
Yeah, thank you very much, Shane, and thanks to ODI for inviting me to speak here today. As I said, the Danish Refugee Council, we are a member of the ALNAP network, and the ALNAP network is a network among humanitarian NGOs and research organizations or institutes as well that focus on improving the work around evaluations in our sector. But ALNAP also conducted research themselves, and they host a community of practice among people in similar positions as me. So actually, what I'll present next, a lot of the work I've done inside the Danish Refugee Council on improving the work around evaluations, ALNAP have been a huge support. But of course, the challenge is that I haven't fixed it yet. It's not their fault, but it's still something that we would continue working on together. So I think the perspective I'll try to bring here is very much from inside a humanitarian organization. Some of the challenges that have now been mentioned on working in very complex situations. How do we deal with them? But I'll also to begin with, be giving you a little bit of the frame around what does an organization like ours actually look like, what kind of resources do we have for this. So I'll take it a little bit in steps. First, show you a little bit about how do we work around evaluations, and then next, what are the key challenges that we still face. So for those of you who don't know our organization that well, I can say that we are a humanitarian organization that had a mandate and a core focus on protection of refugees and internally displaced. We are in more than 30 countries around the world, and most of them are fairly complex emergencies, so there's not a lot of holiday destinations or family duty stations that we would call it. It's South Sudan, it's Somalia, it's Afghanistan, Yemen. We are in the countries around the Syrian crisis or around Syria, and we're also inside Syria. And then relevant for the event here today, we have been working for the last 2 to 3 years with the support of ALNAP on strengthening how we work with evaluations in our organization. So just to give you a snapshot of what are the steps that we have been trying to put into place, you can see the first thing we have done to try to institutionalize the use of evaluations is to have like clear expectations in the organization on when do we actually conduct evaluations. So you can call that triggers for evaluations. So here we have developed an evaluation policy that sets out some thresholds for when is it that we conduct the evaluations. Then next, fostering learning around evaluations. I think the key thing is to get as much staff as possible involved in the exercise around evaluations. So we have tried with different means of institutionalizing the use of our own staff in evaluations, using debriefing throughout our evaluation processes as well. And then I think as the classic approach to linking evaluation and learning in any organization is to ensure feedback loops or learning cycles that are linked to your program management. I guess that's common for not only humanitarian organizations, but any organization, that you would have some way where it's institutionalized, that you pick up the findings and recommendations that come out of evaluations and feed them into your strategic development of new proposals and pilot projects. And then we try to work with the dissemination of findings from our evaluations. And there we have done a very practical thing, is to develop what we call evaluation and learning brief, which is a simple 4-pager. So this is just one way we have tried to move a little bit beyond the 100-page evaluation report that maybe not every one of us have time to read, and see how can we spread the knowledge that's in evaluations throughout the organization and make it more accessible. So we try to write this in a non-technical language, and we share it internally and externally. Just to give you an example of what, these things I've talked about now, what do they look like in reality? If you take the process that we have around real-time reviews, other organizations call it real-time evaluations. If you look at the triggers there, it's something that's centrally led from Copenhagen. The reviews that we do. If you look at the trigger, then it's the scale of the response. We have something called a corporate emergency response. Whenever that's declared, then we do a real-time review, so it becomes kind of an automatic reaction. Participation, we use mixed teams with, I would say, some success, having external consultants come in, bringing in their expertise from other organizations, but linking them up with our own staff, so we ensure that some of the learning stays inside the organization as well. Feedback, we do debriefing sessions at all levels. It's kind of a light approach, so a lot of the reviews is about getting staff involved and having debriefing and discussions at all levels, from the very field level and all the way up to Copenhagen and HQ. So this all sounds fairly simple, I guess. And so what is really the problem, or what is the challenges? And I would say that we still very much face some of the common and classic challenges with the work around evaluation. And one of them is the disconnect between the local level and doing evaluations at the very field level and linking it up to our strategy at the global level. This is a key challenge. And there are some basic things around why this is a challenge that is fairly easy to point out to. I would say that around maybe 80 to 90% of the evaluations that are done in an organization like ours is done at project level. So this might be very relevant for the project team and for also sometimes the country team, but getting out the learning from very context-specific evaluations and using them for the larger organization to increase and improve our work, that demands resources. The reason why we do the most evaluation at project level is both because of the donor demands. The donor contracts we have are often at the project level. So the evaluations are kind of written into the contracts there. And then next, we are a very decentralized organization, meaning that a lot of decisions on evaluations are actually taken at the field level. And then, as this number here points out, 6,000 to 1, that's the ratio of how many HQ M&E staff we have at the moment compared to field staff. So I'm a little bit overburdened sometimes. Of course, I have a lot of colleagues helping me out, and I have over 40 M&E specialists in the field. But to do meta-evaluations or synthesis reports, which some of you in the room maybe have worked with, it demands a lot of resources. So I'm actually happy to announce now that we just put up a vacancy yesterday for another position in Copenhagen working on this. So if there's anyone interested, you can look at ALNAP's webpage, and it's announced there just yesterday. If you are considering it, I think you should definitely know about this next challenge that we face, which I would say is a very very particular thing for a humanitarian organization is about the culture of urgency, as we call it. Obviously, an organization like us have a mandate of saving lives and delivering. And the staff that works in an organization like us, that works in the field, that works in Syria, that works in these places, they of course have their priorities is to deliver. And then maybe after that, they will do procurement or HR, and then after that, comes evaluation. So, and I think, from my side, of course, that's the challenge, and that is something that I would like to go in and have a dialogue with our staff. But of course, this is also the way it should be in an organization like us. That is why we exist. We have a mandate to, of course, learn and an obligation to improve the work that we do. So, but there needs to be a kind of a balance around it. And I think, it's not so much a critique of the evaluation exercise itself. I don't think there's that much pushback anymore. The quote I have up there is from a discussion I had with one of our senior field managers a couple of weeks ago, and he said, Mikkel, we really do love evaluations. It's just that we just have this problem we need to fix first, and then then we'll get back to you, or then we will look into this. So it's not so much that there is not support, I would say. It's just that there are other urgent needs often. So that's why I guess real-time reviews and real-time evaluations have obviously become very popular in organizations like us, because they're flexible and more light, and they can be integrated into the work that we're already doing. So you can say you can still love evaluations a little bit and then do your work and fix problems. But and at the same time, that clarifies the critique that is there against the larger impact evaluations that we're also here to talk about today, that they are often accused in organizations like us for actually delaying implementation. So back to the culture of urgency and why that is not something that goes against the DNA of organizations like us. There's also some that are voicing critique now of the reviews for being too light. So of course it's shifting back and forth these things. So I'll end there and just point to a few of the things that I see as, at least from our organization, the way we will try to take some of these challenges forward is trying, of course, to move beyond the project level and see if we can develop some pilot processes around new methods that keeps the flexibility of the reviews and the real-time evaluation processes, but at the same time lift up the focus a little bit to maybe program country-wide level and have some of the robust data collection designs from the impact evaluations as well. And we are already in dialogue with some of our donors and also universities on supporting us in some of these processes. So with that, I'll say, thank you.
Thanks, Mika. We'll finally turn to Rick, who will provide some overarching comments about these three presentations, as well as pose some questions to the panelists and to the wider group. And then we'll take questions from the audience. So please be thinking of intriguing questions shortly.
Okay, I'll try and make some comments about each of the presentations. Can everybody hear me? Is this mic working? Yes, I think it is. Michael Patton's quote I thought was pretty good. But I think it's not just the evaluation consultants who are sort of over-promising, it's also the clients who are over-asking, and I think this point has been touched upon earlier. So it's really two sides of the same coin. And I think this is part of something which has been described in another setting as what could be called the conspiracy of optimism, prevalent in aid programs where we all know objectives are hopelessly optimistic, but we all jointly agree to pursue them anyhow. And I do wonder whether we are frightened of being more realistic and frightened of what would happen if we were. Would aid flows dry up? What would happen? Would the sky fall in? Going on to Simon's presentation, I thought his discussion about the definitions of impact was a really useful discussion. And I would interpret what Simon was saying as we're not searching for a singular best definition, but rather trying to get acceptance of a pluralist view of what impact is all about, and looking at, thinking about a menu of different ways of seeing impact. And I've sort of reinterpreted and added a few things to what Simon has said, and I'll make three distinctions here. The first is there are differences in the way we conceive of impact in terms of distance. One is of temporal distance. Impact is something that happens far in the future, and that's the view of the OECD DAC definition. It's about long-term changes. But there are some times when that's really a blinder to really important things that are happening very immediately. If you're running a maternal health program and a woman dies from complications because she didn't get adequate care from an emergency referral to a hospital, you wouldn't turn around and say, look, we're not going to attend to that. That impact is a long-term thing. We'll wait until we get some aggregate statistics on maternal mortality arising from complications. You know, any sane person would want to know exactly what happened in that case and respond to it immediately. So the circumstances where a temporal distance view is not an appropriate view or not an appropriate singular view of impact. And then there's a view of distance in terms of socially distant. Some aid programs are operating through long causal chains, in fact, long connections between people and institutions. And that has its own problematic aspect because a lot of interventions may be quite early in that stream and begging the question of, you know, should we even aim to assess impact way down that long causal chain, or should we, along the lines of outcome mapping, say let's focus a bit more on the boundary partners and then add and see what's happening to those and then make some justifiable assumptions but testable assumptions about what happens thereafter. Then there's another angle to impact which I think is underemphasised, and that's impact as a singular versus a diverse event. We have two perspectives here. One is causes of effect perspective, where we might look at a particular thing like maternal mortality and try and track down what's the main cause of that. And we can address that by experimental methods or what I'd call pattern finding methods, which might involve correlate statistical analysis, data mining or QCA. But then there's the other side of that, which is what is called effects of a cause perspective. So a particular cause, a particular intervention, like increasing the qualification requirements for midwives, may have all sorts of impacts. And you may want to track down all those different types of impacts, not just focus on one impact. And in those sort of settings, this is where participatory methods can be quite useful because I'll be asking a range of people about a range of experiences of what has happened as a result of a particular activity. The last perspective, and it's not by any means the only one that exists full stop, but impact is a consequent part of a causal relationship, and that's the World Bank sort of experimental perspective. And the focus on, while that can be very useful in certain circumstances, we know that can risk locking us out of seeing a lot of unexpected effects. It's a kind of causes of an effect approach. But there is a good side to this as well, because I think it gets us to focus on the relationships between the events that are taking place and not just counting the numbers of events that are taking place. I'll move on to Laura's comments. I think there were just two things there that I was interested in, if I can just track back to things there. Yeah. I suppose decentralisation is one of those sort of good things that we unquestionably sort of often think is inherently a good thing. And I can see in these circumstances, particularly in the Syria situation, where decentralisation of an evaluation function is really going to increase the relevance of any evaluation activity that's going to be carried out compared to a centrally prioritised and initiated evaluation. But I do wonder whether it might come at a cost of underutilisation of evaluation results of a different kind. You'll get a much greater relevance use of evaluation findings locally in the Syrian context, for example, as a result of decentralisation. But there are all these other evaluations taking place in these other countries, and whereas before your problem of underutilisation was of field staff not making use of centrally run evaluations, you may now have a problem of field staff in one country having really useful local evaluations but knowing very little about all the evaluations taking place in those other countries because they're highly decentralised, and perhaps even knowing what's happening there may be problematic. So I think that was the main comment I had. In terms of evaluation strategies in the Syria context, I really can understand the thrust towards a strong monitoring focus, because I think in that setting, perhaps above all, there is a distinction made often between implementation failure and theory failure when it comes to evaluation. And there's no point testing out the theory if the implementation hasn't actually worked. So in this setting, I would have thought tracking the possibility of implementation failure would be the number one priority, and you could do that by good, careful monitoring. And only after that would you invest in the luxury, inverted commas, of doing a sort of evaluation which is focused on the theory behind how things worked. Now that may be a rather crude black and white distinction, but I think implementation failure in these sort of settings must be a really high risk and really worth tracking very carefully. The last comments are about Michael's presentation. I was really interested in the focus of the evaluation here, and I think it applies across the board in many circumstances, that when we're talking about evaluation in the context of organisational learning, we're talking about one part of a wider picture. Back in the 1980s, I think it was, there was an organisational theorist called James March who argued that organisational learning has two aspects. One is exploitation of past knowledge, and the other is exploration of new knowledge. In sort of normal sort of common sense terms, it's about remembering what we've done in the past and learnt in the past and acquiring new information. And I think a lot of what Michael was presenting is about how we will gain new knowledge, how we will learn new things. But in a humanitarian context, from my understanding, at least in the past, turnover of staff can be a really major problem. Turnover of staff means loss of memory, loss of institutional memory. So the question I would ask Michael is, how in those circumstances do you cope with this loss of memory and manage that as a real issue alongside keeping up to date with what's happening today? And finally, last point is about you're struggling to make use of or to have adequate evaluation response in these settings. To what extent have you made the data that you've collected about all your activities, put it into the public domain so that third parties can try and analyse it and get value out of it? This is where things are moving these days. 3IE is putting all its data sets into the public realm, differed in some circumstances, which I'm associated with, putting data from evaluations into the public realm. And only that way will we start to extract the full value from all that knowledge that's been accumulated. Thank you.
Thanks, Ray. I think this notion of conspiracy of optimism and over-asking and over-promising, and that we're all engaged in, maybe facade is too much, or is too strong a word, but I think kind of these challenges are exactly why we wanted to host this event today, because I think we all are recognizing these things, but we don't necessarily voice them and really talk about them openly and strategize together about how we can address some of these challenges. So what we'll do now is take a round of 3 questions from the audience here, and then we'll have the panelists respond both to Rick's comments and to yours.